So I will speak of hospitality under compassion and violence. Please come in and be in my home like if it was yours. Be my guest, you whom I don't know. Can hospitality like forgiveness be offered to the other unconditionally? What allows this gesture to take place? As an experience of an encounter and recognition, hospitality presupposes at least two persons, the host and the guest, and a space where it takes place, institutes a symbolical line of separation between the world of the host and the coming of the wanderer. Present both in the Hellenic world and the Hebraic one, hospitality is holding together, as separated, the profane and the sacred. As such, it can take the figure of a theoxeny, visitation of a god in a house of mortals. Inhospitality to a god is severely punished. From here comes the idea that hospitality is a sacred gesture, the hosted guest being the mediator between two divided spheres, allowing a community to grow, coming both as a threat and as a gift. But the threshold has turned out to be an unnamed void for us as hunted subjects who, unlike the Hellenic hero or the Cartesian subject, don't belong anymore to the realm of an ordered space, but are condemned to seek in a much darker night the possibility of relation to the otherness, with no guarantee that the hospitality we are called upon to give has a sense anymore. Hospitality has become the gateway to hell. I'm aware that this might sound hyperbolic, but I do, however, mean it seriously. One could picture Cerbère in the ancient representation of hell, guarding the entry of the underworld, or Horus in the Egyptian mythology, weighing the good and bad actions as they are presented to them by the new trespassers, as figures of radical hospitality, as they separate the living from the dead. In the face of today's political rules, hospitality is not an invitation for a better life. At most, it offers shelter. But it is a fully armed technological gate, serving as a limit and a threshold. Here, the civilized world begins, no trespassing. Hospitality is no longer a spiritual ritual, neither a private gesture, nor it is an issue for a whole society anxious to close its frontiers to illegal immigrants and refugees, the desperate solicitants of this world. From this moment, it has turned into a question of who is deserving it and who simply isn't. To whom will we extend our pity, our compassion, our acknowledgement, or, for that matter, our contempt? Hospitality simply has become another item in an arsenal that the host commands, no return or reciprocity expected. Hospitality, though, has been in the root of all primitive human societies, because the condition of exile could easily revert in an instant. The minute this is lost sight of, we assume that we are the ones who belong, while the other doesn't, because he or she is the other, the stranger, the one who asks for citizenship, protection, recognition. A power game sets in which hospitality becomes something that you can choose to offer or withhold. Also, doubtlessly, because one of the laws that built all civilization is the incest taboo, which means, as Lévi-Strauss has well exposed it, that a society functioning in an endogamic way is doomed. The acceptance of the other, even to the point of the dissolution of self-enclosed tribes or groups, the extension of the hospitality to the stranger, is the condition of the survival of all human society. So the immemorial law of hospitality also reminds us of the fact that the one who takes in the host may well be from the one day to the next cast on the road and in need of refuge. Such was the unwritten rule that the foreigner be received and honored like a king. It's not about charity here. This primordial directive invokes something similar to a kind of Bakhtinian carnivalesque, as the poor and needy can turn into masters and even prevail, if only temporarily, over them. But most of all, hospitality is the question that the foreigner addresses to us from a place of exile. So before I continue to inquire further into a possible interpretation of these conditions, I would like to recall how Derrida forever opened the question for us of hospitality. For it is the unresolved tension between unconditional hospitality and the conditions imposed upon the act of hospitality that Derrida was the first to urge us to reconsider. In the Apology of Socrates, at the beginning of his defense, Socrates addresses his judge and the court, announcing that he is going to defend himself against the accusation of being a kind of sophist. But most of all, he declares that he will speak and remain a foreigner, and a foreigner to the language of the court and the tribunal. He says he doesn't have the skill, and he is like a foreigner. The foreigner is first of all foreigner to the language in which the duty of hospitality is formulated, the right to asylum, its limit, norms, policing. He has to ask for hospitality in a language which by definition is not his own, imposed by the master, the lord, the state. And that's the first act of violence, and makes the question of hospitality a political event, no matter how it is ritualized. This is where the question of hospitality begins, writes Derrida. Must we ask the foreigner to understand us, to speak our language in all the senses of this term, so as to be able to welcome him in our country? If he was already speaking our language with all that implies, if we already shared everything that is shared with the language, would the foreigner still be a foreigner? And could we speak of asylum or hospitality in regard to him? To put it in different terms, absolute hospitality requires that I open up my home and that I give not only to the foreigner, provided with a social status, a family name, etc., but to the absolute, unknown, anonymous other, and that I give place to them, that I let them come and take the place, in the place I offer them, without asking either for reciprocity or even for their names. We have alluded to this, the difference, one of the subtle and sometimes ungraspable difference between the foreigner and the absolute other is that the latter cannot have a name or a family name. The absolute or unconditional hospitality I would like to offer him or her presupposes a break with hospitality in the ordinary sense. In saying this, one more, we are taking account of an irreducible pervertibility, recalls Derrida. And he adds, the law of absolute hospitality commands a break with hospitality by right, with law or justice as right. Just hospitality breaks with hospitality by right, not that it condemns or opposes to it. And it can, on the contrary, set and maintain it in a perpetual progressive movement. But it is as strangely heterogeneous to it as justice is heterogeneous to the law, to which it is yet so close, from which in truth it is indissociable. But let's go back an instant to the etymological that you may all know, but it's so important to see that that's where it comes from. The Latin root of the word hospitality suggests this much. Hostis means both the inviting master of the house and the invited guest. However, hostis has also developed to mean hostility and the enemy. Thus, hostility and host have a common root in our language. the host is de facto always a potential enemy. Like, for example, hostis also gave despot, the despot, and hostia, the victim. Derrida coined the term hospitalité to capture this ambivalence. The foreigner excites the fantasy as the one who comes to dispose of you and of your own property, or even to seduce you. Derrida compared the question of unconditional hospitality to one of parricide. The father is the host of the house, while the foreigner, from the moment when the door is opened to him, enjoys all rights, even the right to take the master's place. And many fears in focus nowadays dealing with the actual question of illegal immigration can be related to this fear. So absolute hospitality is an obligation to welcome the other without asking him anything, neither his identity, nor where he comes from, or where he lives. No economy can be reasonably based upon it, since it would radically subvert the rules of social community based on exchange and reciprocity, a certain symmetry. Western economic society based on exchange was pressured to recognize the rule of hospitality. All public places that rose in Europe from the 14th century on, churches, hospitals, and alike, started to reconsider the rules of hospitality and interrogate the minimum information required to the poor, the refugee, the wounded. Thus, the intrusion of the foreigner into the home was subjected to certain rules. Whom we are going to open our doors to, and under what circumstances. How long can one be hosting a foreigner to protect himself against the violation of his home, or even violence as such? In this question that integrates the moral reflection of Kant, he reflected, for example, in the famous text of the Lot, the hospitality of Lot, as well as of Diderot and the encyclopedists. At time of colonial conquest, what hospitality could be offered to the so-called savage, the stranger arriving in his or her own unfamiliar codes and cultures? But doesn't asking the other to come on towards us and into a common space constitute already a kind of violence? Can this still be called hospitality? It is of eminent importance to be able to conceptualize the consequences of such violence, since it is here that the question of space, though of a common achievement as architecture and language, emerge. Violence too often results from our inability to recognize the so-called otherness of the other as being in fact too close to us, a part of ourselves. Someone personally invited into a space where not even a moment of recognition, nor language, nor identity, nor mutual understanding is offered, might be tempted to commit an act of violence, as the welcome manifests itself as violence. Hospitality is not a mise en demeure. It is not enslavable. It's only when I meet and recognize the other as preceding me and my knowledge that the possibility of true hospitality emerges. For Lévinas, the other is revealed precisely by his otherness, not as a negative impact to the self, but as the phenomenon of kindness, what he calls kindness. This other, who might be the agent of the utmost violence, who, if he chooses to, can kill me, destroy me, alienate me, how can I welcome him without reserve? The transcendent quality of hospitality, neither religious nor purely political, would be this point where the other impacts our inner selves, urging us to offer a shelter to the other within ourselves. The other as the possibility to become oneself is, since the Freudian revolution, a pact with the possibility of the insanity within. Foucault has, in his own brilliant way, analyzed how the way society treated and regulated the insane could reveal the relation it has to the necessity of repression and censorship in general. What it is at stake here is the question of hospitality extending beyond madness to the disorders of otherness. The situation has never been more threatening, I think, than it is today. People are treated in psychiatric hospital, a space that only etymology relates to hospitality, where now silence is more terrifying than before the cries that you could hear, because it's a medicated silence, is the signature of our oblivion and denial, our collective forgetting that madness is the question that we, haunted subjects of desire, want to elude as a frightening guest or spectral guest, returning to us from a traumatic past. Wilfrid Bion, the brilliant English psychiatrist who nearly died in the 1970 in the Battle of the Somme, spent his life taking care of the insane, but also of the traumas of war, and writing, for example, Taming Wild Thoughts, among other titles. For him, thinking is a machine of swallowing wild thoughts, thoughts that present themselves to the intellect. And in this intimate struggle between madness and thought, it is wild thought that wins. But it wins in secret. It takes refuge in folded papers, twisted words, dreams, stammering emanation from the memory of death. It is childhood language that suddenly reappears. In this sense, in Bion's view, wild thoughts without a thinker, he calls them, have indeed something to do with hospitality to madness, for they submerge our patiently consolidated beliefs. If to philosophize is also learn to die, then night makes room in our ever so diurnal world for the memory of those dead souls that come back to us with their language and their history, with barbarism, suffering, war, alliance, and betrayals. When one suddenly hears the end of their voices come to free up a little of the burden weighting down souls. What is transmitted then is a secret order to make way to the hospitality towards the traumatic era of our common history. In our social economy, where possession and belongings have acquired an ethic of their own, the danger of having everything taken away is felt to be unbearable, and the act is considered criminal, especially when such an act compromises a place. That can be called ours, and the right to have a home. So one supposes the right to belong somewhere, somehow. But have we not forgotten in that process that only someone who hasn't forgotten that he, she is a dweller and thus potentially a host, in the both senses, can genuinely belong? That there is no such right if you don't first derive it from hospitality and exile. Hospitality is an experience rather than a concept. Lévinas wrote that he preferred the term épreuve to experience, because the former, which means test, not exactly, but implies both the idea of life and its critical verification, something that overwhelms the self by challenging its endurance. It opts for a kind of trial, a test seat in which the self is played at absolute risk. The call for verification, quotation mark, indicate it's always provisional verification, indicates a life submitted to incessant probing and perpetual revision. They are, in this sense of épreuve or event, two events, or rather two experiences, that a subject, an ego, we cannot think completely. That is our birth and our death. If at all, we can only conceptualize it as a general, but certainly not as a personal human experience. Our birth, in fact, constitutes the first act of hospitality, offered to, not by us, and not in a psychological, that is another problem, but as an ontological one, existential one. We come from a mother's womb. We begin our being as cells splitting and growing until we finally part, indeed disassemble ourselves from another human being who has at least carried us long enough to be born. I will accept the problem of love here. In this special case, hospitality actually is the precondition of life, to life. Usually the body does not accept any form of unrecognized otherness. As such, the latter constitutes a threat to be fought and destroyed. A baby, on the contrary, is a result of a process of differentiation that has made him, her, another. However, right from the beginning, death looms, and if hospitality is about thresholds, an act of trespassing, death makes us aware that our finitude makes us visitor here on earth, a precondition for hospitality as such. Hospitality consequently is rooted in the experience of death, of letting go, of abandoning everything you loved, acquired, imagined. Hospitality then is by necessity based upon the exilic condition of humankind as such, and related to the possibility of death and the experience of mourning, which offers hospitality to the dead, their language, as Hannah Arendt recalls us, and their memory. In every so-called primitive cultures, offering burial to the dead bodies and hospitality to the strangers were, as I said, the most, in that sense, important rules shared by the living. Hospitality is also a kairos, an instant of grace in the right moment when it can happen. The question of the border, the limit, the threshold, the step beyond the limit recurs here, also in the question of a space-time to be reopened. As if the impossibility of marking out a stable territory could constitute a provocation to thought itself. To offer hospitality, Derrida wonders, is it necessary to start from the certain existence of a dwelling, or is it rather only starting from the dislocation of the shelter, from homelessness, that the authenticity of hospitality can open up? Perhaps only the one who endures the experience of being deprived of a home can offer hospitality. Night, for the philosophian Patočka, is the opening into what disturbs. It asks us to traverse, to go beyond the experience of the loss of meaning, an experience which engenders the authenticity of philosophical thinking. If we take in account Patočka's reflection on his experience at the frontier lines of the World War I, this might be impossibly far removed from any concept of hospitality, as war is prone to aggravate distinction into binary opposition. However, in this night experience of the front, the adversary is no longer the same. Patočka says that he is our accomplice in the disturbance of the day. So here is what the abyssal domain of prayer for the enemy opens to us, the solidarity of the shaken. I quote. The condition of our native exile is our inability to have a land of our own. The night of hospitality, according to Patočka, The question of the non-place of an impossible dwelling makes sense only if the act of hospitality belongs neither to the host nor to the guest, but to the gesture by which one of them welcomes the other. This is why the distinction between absolute hospitality and the laws of hospitality is essential. For it threatens a society that has chosen transparency as a method to totalize power through fragmenting responsibility. The question that the foreigner poses us resounds in Utopia, in the Greek sense of an atopos, the non-place, prophetically conceived by Thomas More, which nowadays would designate the out-of-place, from which the question of hospitality is imposed on or to us. By turning into ideology, Utopia has acquired a language, linking it to the implacable logic of economic efficiency, which it was once designed to counter. Utopia's collapse at the very core, transfixed by a nostalgia for a timeless fixity they assume in this proposed to work at all. Right in our face, the political has disintegrated into the subtle coils of economic efficiency, extinguishing its trace behind it. Today, starting from that radical unfamiliarity of language in a foreign land, as both Derrida and Lévinas evoke them, should we not rightfully expect in political utopia a placelessness which opens the possibility of a human cosmopolitism? A utopia that has become audible nowadays because it acknowledged the other, that unexpected and always disturbing guest, who might well constitute one of the spectral appearances of our time. If creating time is equivalent in Hebrew to invitation, there has to be some kind of otherness, an intrusion of a genuine other into the normal mathematical time frame that does not allow for time to be created, let alone by some other. The future, the not yet, not here, is given to us as that which comes to us from the other, from what is absolutely surprising here, new, incalculable, untimely. So what happens when our eyes rest up the words hospitality, proximity, enclave, hate, foreigner, all the semantic constellation? Is it really possible to speak of alterity, let alone to think it, without thinking being instantly put to a test? Speaking about language, about what Derrida has shown us, about pervertibility, I just want to point out that in French the word putting to question also means torture. If we can agree that murder and hate designate everything that excludes closeness, it is insofar as they ravage an original relationship to alterity. The hostis responds to hospitality in the way that the ghost recalls himself to the living by not allowing them to forget. To the pacified reason of Kant, Derrida opposes the primary hunting of a subject prevented by alterity from closing itself off peacefully. Today, we no longer believe in the enchantments so well staggered by Nietzsche in his Zarathustra. We organize mystifications. We build the future chambers where we'll be spellbound. Between enchantment and spells, there is the crypt. Here there is no trespassing, and the possibility of hospitality is only the realm of compassion for what is already lost or at loss in recognition of the other as such. Hospitality begins when there is no more subject imprisoned by his own echo, just someone who is there, a guest presenting itself in that indefinite space of the present that is the very space of every true event. An event is an encounter that has an infinitesimal likelihood of occurring, and that has nevertheless taken place. It does nothing but express this, the opening of the present to the unhoped for, to the over and above, or to what one would like still to call grâce. If philosophy has resolved, with the help of Wittgenstein in particular, to seek in language the condition of possibility of conceptualizing the world, in that language that it has encountered the unsayable, the untranscribable, the pure signifier, as Lacan would say, that is, a place for the other. Hospitality under compassion and violence, that is to say, hospitality under the violence of radical ethics, caused by radical compassion, would be unconditional hospitality. Only then and at this price are we able to think the rules of hospitality. Thank you.
Okay, but anyway, thank you for the hospitality.
Thank you.
Okay, come on, guys. Let me help you with the discussion a little bit. Yes.
I had one question. Thank you for your talk, Professor Dufourmantelle. A sonic signature that caught my ear that I want to ask you about regarding a certain paradox in Derrida, or contradiction in Derrida's thought on the impossibility of hospitality. I'm thinking particularly about the statement that you made regarding hospitality and the site of hospitality as having to unfold in the space of perpetual travel and in what I heard a sense of perpetual homelessness and wandering. I'm thinking particularly of the text Contretemps, the counterpath, that Catherine Malabou and Derrida authored together, in which he quite provocatively opens the question of traveling and traveling with. And says that this is something that he's never been able to let anyone do with him, that he can actually never let anyone travel with, that this is the moral question, this is the question in his kind of hypochondriac mode that he will never allow. And so I'm curious about what this means for proximity of opening. Is there a threshold or an erogenous zone in Derrida's thought that even will irritate him to the point where no closer can anyone come in the modality of traveling? If you have any thoughts on that idea, if I'm clear at all.
The question, I guess, with the paradox he went upon between absolute laws of hospitality and the conditions and the rights was he thought of it, I think, as a horizon, something that we should never forget, not that it could work as such, or never could, as an utopia, become the way a common party could make something of this absolute hospitality. But he emphasized the fact that if we forget to tend towards this absolute, then something of the way we apply the rights and duties of hospitality in social society, something very important is lost that we have no even idea of, and that is endangering even the principle of democratic society. It's a little bit, I say that in the way he puts on this paradox. It's like when he says, when you offer hospitality to a human being, you have to take account also in somehow for the animal in one way, and to the phantom of the spectre or the divine in the other, because only if you hold this whole range, then you can really offer hospitality to a human being. That's the way he always opened the focus, I think. And for this question of traveling, I don't know, I have this anecdote of how I got to know him, and that was, I was attending the seminar, and I was so taken aback by the experience, the philosophical experience of being at his seminar. That is, as I had tried to relate it, you really went along with him in a path that you find quite secure, and he was, showing this and that, and look at the landscape, and here are this concept, and suddenly he would take the rug, and you would be confronted to the void, and now what is it? How are you going to think this? And he left you in front of this paradox, and you really had the experience. I had heard various philosophers and even Habermas, and I never quite had this experience that I had again with Avital of the philosophy as an experiment. And again, when I came with my as a solicitor to his hospitality, saying I would really like to publish these two seminars because they are so important. I know you already have a publisher, blah blah blah, but please, could we do something? And he answered, well, no, I already have a publisher, but you can write on me. And I said, no, I'm not going to auto-publish myself. So he said, well, I will be traveling, so try to convince me, write something about this, what you're asking. So I wrote this text about his relation to hospitality and sent him somewhere in this traveling. So it was not about traveling with, but it was the letter went traveling in some space in the States, and I received the answer also by letter, saying, well, why not try to make hospitality a gesture in a book? That is to put the two texts. So that's sort of an answer.
First, thank you for this evening and the last 3 days as well. I just had a couple of questions, if you could elaborate on them. You made this distinction between charity and justice, and I'm wondering where those lines are drawn and how they're articulated. And later on you talked a little bit about the tension between transparency and the fragmentation of responsibility in terms of social systems. If you could elaborate on that a little bit more as well.
Transparency, I think, is the sort of underlying, invisible, asked, how I could put it, ideology, today's ideology. That's no news, but I think it's, as what we were talking about this afternoon, about the security ideology and the assurance that we should be assurance and want ourselves, this self-insurance. I think transparency it even uses the vocabulary of psychology to say you should avow, you should yourself be transparent for your own sake. And we should share a safe space and as transparent as it is possible. And I think that in that caring or in that ideology, the responsibility can only be fragmented, because it's as if for the price of this transparency, you get to not be designated as a responsible one, but you can sort of share a safe space of, well, I don't find it safe, but it is supposed to be safe. And as for charity and justice, I was relating, I think, to the fact that since the Abrahamic encounter that Avital recalled us with the angels and this convocation calling of the hospitality to the who can be God, hospitality wasn't supposed to be a charity. The charity and the pity for the poor and is a sort of declination, a Christian declination of what charity should have been, and that you also find in Ulysses and the Theoxonia, that you can always discover that it's the God visiting you, and what if you don't recognize it?
Yeah, Avital?
So I just wanted to thank you, and to maybe this is a pedagogical delirium that I wanted to, may I emphasize 2 points that I thought you made very quickly, and perhaps you all got it, but one thing was when you asked, or you pointed out that through the Kantian text, one question is, who is in the position to offer hospitality? And does that presuppose that you own a house or a space so that you can receive the other? And that's why it was radically compelling to imagine the hospitality of the one who doesn't own or have property or have the proper means by which to lavish the stranger and or the invader or the friend who shows up. You know, so that was one thing that maybe you all got that, but who is even in the position to offer hospitality, and what kind of framing and delimitation is that? How problematic is that? The other point that Derrida makes, and I think you whizzed by that, is one, you talked about Lot very briefly, and I just wanted to mention that Derrida reminds us that the cultural story of hospitality that we blindly inherit and are still burdened by and bowed by and full of repressive energy toward is the way Lot offered up his daughters to the strangers who came to visit, which is to say that the radical paradigm for hospitality is to offer up, what are you shaking your head for? The daughters for the rape of the stranger, of the visitor, which asks what is the limit of giving to the other.
It's not, well, there are two kinds of visitors in Lot. No, just to say that Lot hosted strangers as gods, and when the other came up, that is the wanting to put to death the stranger hosted by Lot, he would offer his daughters. And it's very important also because, while I probably skipped or went too quickly by, is the whole family question here. As we think we need a house or a place, which is absolutely not evident to the question of hospitality, we think that it's the place, mostly we think of it as a metaphorical place of a family place, and that hospitality asks us to, in a way, break out with this link, with this family link or loyalty, and interrogates it very radically, to the point where the only worth community would be what's coming with this encounter and creating a sort of new time or new beginning. At least it's a real question.
Thank you very much. That was another beautiful talk about hospitality, and I had a beautiful lecture about hospitality by Avital, a couple of years ago, and also by Diane Davis, and I myself wrote on hospitality. But it seemed to me that, seeing and hearing to all these lectures, it seems to me we're stuck, all of us seem to be stuck at the place where Derrida left us. So my question is, as long as we speak about hospitality, we seem to be always talking about the same things, and in the end it's this being caught in the euphoria between the laws and the law of hospitality, maybe, or other things too, perhaps. So my question would be, do you feel the same, that we're stuck somewhere? And if not, where do we go from here with hospitality?
How to get over Derrida, huh?
Actually, yeah, maybe that's one thing. The break
very
hospitality,
hospitable.
with hospitality might be insisting more on going into where's the ethical point of rupture with hospitality. This is where Wolfgang led me, of course, as my doctoral advisor. But where do you think we can go from here?
I don't think Derrida closed the question. I think he opened it in a way that when he puts up with those paradox as for forgiveness, or as of with this notion, he doesn't offer any way. That's true. He just breaks up with a tension that is left for us and for the other to think with. And for me, I try to displace myself a little bit on the psychoanalytical side and the question of the otherness within, and that as an event, the question of the birth and the death as events of hospitality, as important as the political question of who is the wanderer and host and the master of the house, because there are also leftover questions of our time, I think, no matter how much we're thinking the birth and the ways of the dying, and it's they're relegated to the medical realm or to the psychogenetic one, but philosophy has a bit deserted, I think, this question of why the fact that we are coming from another makes the question of the self, for example, and the encounter of another a forever repeated question that is our question embodied from the beginning, and that thinking that the self as a self-constituted is not enough. We have to tame the fact that we will die alone, but we came from, and this disentanglement from the otherness, and how does that encompasses and merges as a question when we encounter the real other or others. I think, well, that was my focus, but I'm not saying it's a complete opening, but I think it's another path. It can be.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I immediately think, not immediately, but at some point I had to think about this point, and also when Avital talked about the pedagogical situation, and when you related hospitality to the meta l'épreuve, to the testing, that also, of course, developed by Avital. I had to think about the scene in The Sophist when the stranger arrives. In the end, of course, in entering in this famous terracidal scene, but before that, there's this point where Socrates is not very sure whether what he's dealing with. Is he dealing with a god or not? Should he offer him the opening to have this discussion on the logos or not? And in the end, he says, okay, better just stick with him, and it could be a god, but let's see how it will play out. So I'm especially interested in the relation between hospitality and this pedagogical scene, where in the end, how do you put it, Theotitis is prepared to take on the souls and propagates, etc. And I was very fascinated by this, by the relation also, and putting it in perspective of what is going on here. So perhaps you would have some words to say on this issue. Maybe even, although you seem to suggest a certain closure of this relation between this pedagogy that seems to be applied, or pedagogical maneuver, and your own practice as a psychoanalyst, which I guess in some points has relations to this way.
Thank you. There are two ways by which I can respond. On the philosophical one, I think that this figure of theoxenia, that where you don't know if it's the God or not, and how to adjust the discourse, the logos, and the interrogation of the otherness here, we find an interesting example. Interpretation of this in the Theorem of Pasolini, where someone arrives and will dispel completely the whole order of this grande bourgeoisie family by, in a way, what's the most maybe subversive is that he arrives without asking for anything. He's just there. And maybe the guest that doesn't ask is the more subversive and dangerous guest, because he just arrives. In fact, like in Abraham's, they are there, and it's the host coming and saying, but what do you want? What's your desire? And in fact, the host, the guest that doesn't want, entre guillemets, anything, will reveal the suppressed desires and the chaos inside that was very neatly preserved up till there. And we talked in the class also of the figure of the idiot, the Melvillian figure, the Kafkaian, the Dostoevskian, Prince Mushkin. That they are, to me, all figures of this sort of guest arriving in a situation with a kind of look of that is, one would say, innocent or stupid in the Avitalian way, but that cannot bring itself to completely. He knows the language of the one thinking hospitality of him, but he doesn't come back from a bewilderment or as if, and he is staying on his own language, in fact. And the confrontation of this bewilderment and this attitude, this kind of innocence in front of the community that's well organized around certain objects of desires, that blows everything up more than anything, more than any conflict, open conflict. And it's interesting. As for my analytical practice, it would be too long to enter in this, but I think that it's a hospitality scene, that's true. I mean, a session when you receive a new patient, I think it's maybe like the host should never forget that he can always be a guest, and maybe will be again, or a wanderer, or a homeless. Well, maybe so does the psychoanalyst. He should never forget, but not only as a memory, but as an act, that he doesn't know, not only better than the other one where his desire lies, but even where his own, and that there is this hospitality to the unknown in ourselves. That's the basis of the welcoming, I think.
Thank you for your really beautiful. I was really interested in the sort of latter half of what you were saying, vis-a-vis time, and this conception of the event as something that's sort of infinitesimally possible, depending on how you phrase that. But that points to me towards the continuousness of time again, and potentially the way that a radical hospitality could be not with that temporal dimension that it seems to always have. Even birthing, sort of, the host process is always sort of temporally limited. So one example is the way that you have to be hospitable to your parents when they come to your house now, and they've known them your whole life. And maybe the way that a historical hospitality could take place between Israel and Palestine. I'm wondering if that is part of the radical hospitality that's being suggested, something that lasts forever.
It's very interesting, your question, because I think it's sort of a left out question, that the time as itself, because it's more seen as I think, as I said, a vector, a horizon that cannot be incarné, that cannot take body in a way in the laws and justice of hospitality, but can only, like a spectre, haunt it and not let him. It's that the way Derrida often says we cannot be at peace with this question. We have to let ourselves be haunted in order to still have a chance to go towards a question of our freedom, or of our possibility of realizing humankind that is not already here in a Nietzschean way. And so, to me, the question of the time is the kairos is very important, because maybe that's a real hypothesis, but we immediately think hospitality in terms of place, space. What if it was essentially a time, an event, something that is for once and with no return, and that was the difficulty also to think it, because it's a question of time and the right time, or the not the right time. It comes up.
Okay, last question. You have to be hospitable to her and let her go.
What I liked a lot is the kind of double nature of hospitality, and I think it's inherent in ourselves. So, do you think that the most basic hospitality is the relationship between the mind and the body, in a sense that the body is hospitable to the mind, in a sense?
Oh, that's a very beautiful conclusion. Yes, definitely. There's something about the mystery of the body having this first hospitality to not only the brain, the spirit, but us as having been child. And I like also this idea, this Kantian idea, or the beyond one, that we are an idea is visiting us, not we don't have ideas. They have us in a way. And this visitation is also an embodiment, always.
Okay, thank you very much.